event, we will explore different aspects related to climate resilient development in Africa. And that will be introduced going through a number of issues we are familiar with in this COP, and those who are familiar with the COPs on loss and damage, on issues of health, on issues of food, on issues of health, agriculture, on issues related to 1.5 and 2 degrees, on issues related to water, anything that related to our interest in Africa, and then how, in that context, the climate resilient development will look like. It will be, there will be some presentation by the IPCC working group, 2 authors. They work on the chapter on Africa, led by Deborah Roberts, who is the co-chair of working group 2. I will not just do justice to authors. I will just mention their name and what they are their role in the IPCC, because of we need to hear from them rather than to know who they are. After Deborah Roberts, we have Felix Kalala, who is a lead author. Christopher Triso, who is also a lead author. We have Geladio Cisse, a lead author. And we have also 2 other lead authors that will join us remotely, Edmond Totten and Adunya Gemeda. And then they are present, they are with us, but through internet. Without any further information or any further element, we will start the first presentation. I think that Felix is the one who will make it. Let us keep on time, the time allocated, and then so that we'll be able to have more interaction with the audience. There is some chairs in the front. Please don't stay back. Come in the front. There is many chairs here. Sir, you can start.
Good afternoon. So I'll be speaking on the losses and damages, and also looking at future risks in Africa. So this is coming from the African chapter of the working group 2 of the 6th assessment. Next slide, please. It is important just to note or remind ourselves about climate change in Africa, knowing that average and extreme temperatures are rising, and this is actually attributable to climate change. We have seen that the marine heat waves are twice more likely now than though in the past, and then also the multi-year drought are more frequent, for example, in West Africa. A couple of years ago, we experienced the Cape Town droughts, which obviously a number of us gathered here we knew about. So it is just important for us to note that the climate change impacts are quite severe, and they're actually increasing both in frequency and intensity. Next slide, please. Now, why are we looking at climate change impact, and why is Africa an interesting continent to look at? It is important to realize that Africa is very vulnerable, and we are very exposed to climate change impacts. Why is this the case? It's because of our disposition, socio-economically, politically, as well as a number of environmental factors that tend to drive vulnerability. When you look at employment, the majority of the population is actually employed in climate-exposed sectors. We are looking at between 55 to 62% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa being employed in agriculture. And it is also important to note that this agriculture that they're employed into, 95% of this agriculture is rain-fed. We've also seen the growth of the population and infrastructure in all these exposed areas. It is also important to note that around 60% of the urban dwellers in Africa live in informal settlements. So if you look at these factors, the socio-economic disposition, politically, environmental factors, economic factors, all these tend to make Africa more vulnerable to climate change. Next slide, please. What are some of the observed impacts and losses and damage? One is that Africa has already experienced widespread losses and damages that can be attributed to climate change. In the last 2 decades, we've had about 337 million people affected by natural disasters. And we've lost over 46,000 lives. And of these 46,000 lives, about 32% actually have been lost due to floods and 46% due to droughts. There've also been an increase in displacement due to floods. In 2018, we had about 2.6 million of the population that was displaced. 2019, it was about 3.6 million. So all these actually telling us that the observed impacts of climate change are actually increasing. So we are observing now reduced food production, reduced economic activity, losses of biodiversity, as well as increasing human mobility, as well as mortality. Next slide, please. When you look at ecosystem impacts, there's been losses of marine biodiversity and also changing in geographical ranges of animal and plant species. Now, Africa, we are quite well connected to our ecosystem. So when we're looking at changes in geographical ranges as well as plant species, this must also be linked to the very core of the livelihoods because of the interactions that the humans have with the ecosystems. There's been also mass coral reef bleaching as well as wood plant expansion. And this is actually now reducing grazing lands as well as reducing water supplies. Next slide, please. In terms of food security, there's been growth in agriculture productivity by about 4% from about 1961 to date. But when you look at yields, there's been a reduction in yields. For maize, we've had this reduction in sub-Saharan Africa by about 5.8%, as well as yields in wheat reducing. And across, when you look at most of the staple crops, we have observed a reduction in actually the yields. 2/3 of African perceive that climate conditions have actually affected agriculture production. Now, remember in the last slide, I did mention that most of the agriculture that is done in Africa is actually rain-fed. So any changes in droughts or floods is actually affecting food production. So there's been actually a reduction in food security. Next slide, please. What about health impacts? There's been an increase in infectious diseases, the expansion of the mosquitoes into higher altitudes, such as in East Africa. There's been an increase in the instances of malaria in a number of countries within sub-Saharan Africa. Cholera outbreaks, obviously this is mainly linked to floods, which leads to diarrheal diseases. So cholera outbreaks, dysentery, and other diseases. In terms of heat, about 44% of heat-related mortality from 1991 to about 2018, which is also attributable to climate change. So we can see how climate change is actually impacting health. Now, as climate change impacts health, what this entails, therefore, is that the health budget will actually be affected because countries will have to spend a lot of more money on health. Next slide, please. What about water security? More variable rainfall and river discharge. Within sub-Saharan Africa, there's been this reduction in river flows. A couple of years ago, we had a massive load shedding. Countries like Zambia that largely rely on hydroelectricity were severely affected, leading to load shedding of up to 10 hours a day. And that had impacts on the economy. There have also been negative and cascading impacts on multiple sectors, which obviously includes hydro generation. Hydro generation will have also other impacts on agricultural production. It will have other impacts on mining as well as other manufacturing industries. Next slide, please. Now, what are some of the projected impacts? We have observed these impacts, and we can clearly see that Africa has been affected, and this is affecting various sectors. Let's now look at what the future looks like. What is it that is yet to come? What is it that we have to brace ourselves for? Next slide, please. In terms of future risks, at 1.1 degree of recent level of global warming, if we move to about 1.5 degrees, the risk is actually increasing. And when you look at the risk that is increasing, we're looking at the risk increasing in large regional crop losses, risk increasing in poverty and inequality, increases in exposure to diseases, droughts, as well as increasing heat mortality. Now, the situation will actually get worse when you start looking at projections of above 2 degrees. But as we look at projections above 2 degrees Celsius, the risk is very high. This will look at now widespread crop losses. We'll look at widespread heat-related mortality. We're looking at losing our species, and our species are at the risk of extinctions. We're also likely to see about 30% decline in fisheries catch potential. Now, it is important to realize that these losses that we are seeing at 2 degrees are the core of the livelihoods of the people in Africa. And therefore, as we look at these changes, these should actually sound a lot of warning alarms. Look at biodiversity loss and how this is going to change as the degrees of warming increase. So from this slide, we can see that the future looks bleak, and it is therefore important that appropriate measures are put in place because future risks are quite severe. Next slide, please. What are some of the take-home messages? What are some of the things that we need to think about as we look at losses and damages? We have a lot of direct impacts, and when you look at these direct impacts, they are affecting different sectors. They are affecting the functioning and productivity of ecosystems. They are affecting land productivity, affecting us in terms of droughts and floods. And these impacts are not just direct, but there are also other indirect impacts. Looking also at the future risks that we're seeing, what is it that we need to put at the back of our minds? It is, we do not have enough room. What we need to do is we need to limit global warming, because if global warming is limited to about below 1.5, this is likely going to substantially reduce damages to African economies, peoples, and ecosystems. When you start looking at the various regions within Africa, we see that with the projected global warming, there will be reduction in olive production in North Africa. There will be reduction in sorghum production in West Africa, and generally a reduction in staple crops across the continent. So these are the things that are ahead of us, and this is what evidence is showing us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix. Now may I ask Chris and then to give some highlights on the enablers of climate development in Africa. Chris.
Thanks, Yuba. If we could have the next presentation, please. So you heard a lot of really troubling news from Felix about what's already happened in the African continent. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. Troubling news about what's already happened in the African continent, as well as the risks we can expect in the near-term future. It's more likely than not assessed pathways in Working Group 1 of IPCC reach 1.5 within the next few decades. My talk will be about how we can respond to those risks through climate resilient development. We're just waiting for the presentation. To save time, I'll start talking through the concept. And so climate resilient development is a concept that has been introduced in Working Group 2 of the IPCC in this assessment cycle. And next slide, please. Oh. Okay. So from Felix, you heard that every fraction of a degree of global warming increases risks to Africa. And both rapid and deep emissions cuts, as well as ambitious adaptation action, are required to limit these risks. Next slide, please. So what does our future in Africa look like with climate change? And we'll talk through this in the concept of climate resilient development, which combines three things. It's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions through mitigation. It's about reducing climate risks through adaptation. It's about linking biodiversity and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And all of this together is what we'll call climate resilient development. Next slide, please. So to start with the adaptation component of this, in Africa, there are many options we can take to reduce risks from climate change to nature and people. Next slide, please. So good news is there are multiple adaptation options and solutions being deployed in Africa currently. Many of these have co-benefits, and many of them are at least of medium effectiveness, some moderate level of effectiveness at reducing climate change risks. However, what is concerning is there is high uncertainty around their effectiveness at future global warming levels. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so examples of observed adaptations recorded in Africa, often these are local and fragmented efforts. They often focus around behavioral change. They are often in the agricultural sector, such as changing crop varieties or mixed crop and livestock systems that can be more resilient than monocultures. They further include migration, such as urban to rural migration or seasonal migration for employment. Is that better? Okay, so they include migration, such as seasonal migration for employment, ecosystem-based adaptations, particularly for water security, social protection programs. Encouragingly, there's some evidence that when these are designed, even not without climate change explicitly in mind, they can help bridge low-income communities through times of climate shock, for example, through cash transfers that prevent them then having to sell livestock or other assets, and early warning services, such as early warning systems for flooding. Next slide, please. However, there are limits to adaptation. So we know that even effective adaptation cannot prevent all losses and damages. Above 1.5 degrees Celsius, some natural solutions, such as coral reefs protecting from coastal storm surges, may no longer work as those ecosystems die back due to extreme heat. By 2 degrees Celsius, it will be challenging to farm staple crops in many regions of Africa, such as maize in West Africa, where under certain scenarios, even with irrigation, you would not offset net losses from climate change. Next slide, please. There's also potential for maladaptation. In seeking to go faster on adaptation action, we have to be very careful to avoid maladaptation. So this is actions that actually increase risk. Some examples here are, for example, different infrastructure development, such as hydropower that might lead to competing uses of water between energy and irrigation, flood proofing using hard infrastructure, such as concrete seawalls that can increase beach erosion down of the location where the seawall is located, and biofuel or afforestation. Next slide, please. Here's an example with afforestation here defined as planting trees or forests, establishing forests in areas that are not naturally forested, such as the grasslands of Africa. And what you're seeing in green on this map is naturally grassy ecosystems of Africa, grasslands and savannas. And in purple are areas identified by tree planting campaigns, such as the Bond Challenge, as potentially suitable for restoration as degraded lands. However, many of Africa's grasslands are ancient ecosystems with highly endemic biodiversity and millions of people who depend on those ecosystems for their livelihoods, such as through pastoralism. And planting trees in these ecosystems can lead to risks to water and food security, as well as biodiversity. Next slide, please. There are also risks to African infrastructure projects under adaptation programs. In the blue dots here, you see existing hydropower stations in Africa associated with large dams. And in the yellow are planned hydropower stations under planned infrastructure developments for African countries. And you'll see in some river basins, such as the Zambezi, that there is high uncertainty there between what the predicted revenue could be in the average climate scenario with a dot and solid line, and how low it could be under low precipitation scenarios in the future, as much as a 58% reduction in revenue for planned hydropower in that river basin. So these are potentially large maladaptation risks. Next slide, please. There are barriers to adaptation in Africa, primarily around information awareness and technology, finance, and governance and institutions. Next slide, please. I'll highlight some of these now. An important new finding from this IPCC assessment is the chronic underfunding of climate change research in Africa. So since 1990, only 3.8% of research funding for climate change globally has focused on Africa, and that is incommensurate with how vulnerable the continent is to climate change. And when we look inside that 3.8%, only about a quarter of it, so only about 1% of the global total, has actually gone to African researchers and African institutions. Most funding for climate change research on Africa goes to institutions in the European Union and North America. It's only Kenya and South Africa that are ranked 9th and 10th for countries receiving funding for climate change research on African problems. Next slide, please. Another area of information scarcity for adaptation is hydrometeorological observation stations. And so what you're seeing in red dots here are stations that were still active in 2017 to be incorporated into fine spatial and temporal resolution climate data sets that can be used for things like early warning services. And the line on the left is showing the decline over time in active stations. So there's a need here for an investment in on-the-ground weather observation stations to improve things like fine spatial resolution climate information for adaptation. Next slide, please. As Felix said, many Africans perceive that the climate is changing. What you're seeing in the red and the blue here are in dark red and in the darker blue is the proportion of people in local studies who say the climate is changing and the local scientific record agrees with that direction of change. So there's agreement between their perceptions and the changing climate. But what you're seeing in the green is the proportion of people in those countries who understand that that climate change is caused by human greenhouse gas emissions and have some understanding of the implications. So widespread across Africa, people perceive the climate is changing, but our climate literacy is still low. And this is something where education is the strongest predictor of climate literacy, and there can be large gains for adaptation, especially for girls, through education around climate change. Next slide, please. Finance is another important constraint and enabler of faster adaptation and mitigation action. Adaptation finance in Africa is very low, and adaptation cost estimates are typically higher for developing countries as a proportion of their national income, making the self-financing of adaptation more difficult. Investment needs are highest in these medium and low income countries, and Africa also on a mitigation side requires rapid upscaling of financing to avoid lock-in risks of stranded assets for fossil fuels, and that the drop in financing costs of renewable energy projects in centers of energy demand across Africa could reach cost parity with fossil fuels as early as 2025. In some regions that's happened already, but widespread across African energy demand centers by 2025. Next slide, please. So to finish, to bring this all together in a final few messages on climate resilient development. Next slide, please. A major area for action and opportunity for action in climate resilient development is in transforming African cities. Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing region, with about 60% of Africans projected to live in cities by 2050. Large opportunities for climate resilient development here around electrification, nature-based approaches that mix green infrastructure and traditional gray infrastructure, such as improved drainage to reduce flooding in informal settlements, urban agriculture, also expansion of social safety nets that are climate informed for helping low-income people through climate shocks. And these have a lot of wider benefits in terms of ecosystem conservation, but also public health improvements, such as electrification for cooking instead of charcoal-based cooking. Next slide, please. Another major area for African climate action is around the land use sector. Forest loss and degradation is currently very high in African tropical systems, which are some of the world's highest stores of carbon. Mining is a driver of deforestation in some of these areas, as well as wildfires through increased drought in tropical forest areas, and consumption of wood products is projected to exceed production by 2030. Next slide, please. However, the land use sector in Africa can provide large-scale emissions reductions and remove and store CO2 at scale. So that's halting deforestation is the emissions reductions, and then restoring ecosystems is the removal of CO2. This comes through protecting and restoring natural ecosystems, but competing demands for food, water, and energy have to be carefully managed. And it's crucially important here that this cannot compensate for increased emissions elsewhere. These ecosystems are natural ecosystems, and in order to help us with our carbon reduction challenge, we have to keep the level of global warming as low as possible so that, for example, you don't lose the carbon back out of these ecosystems through extreme drought and wildfire. Next slide, please. Finally, climate law. This is a growing area across Africa. Many countries are adopting climate change framework bills. These are bills that sit in over. Kenya have adopted these laws already, enacted them. Many others, they're in draft form or under discussion. And these are a really good opportunity to set an overall framework response in the context of climate resilient development for African countries. Next slide, please. And that's another aspect of this being around health and social protection, where integrating climate adaptation in a more deliberate way into social protection programs, such as cash transfers, public works programs, universal healthcare access, can increase climate change resilience. Next slide, please. And finally, just to emphasize what this enabling of climate resilient development looks like is increased funding for knowledge and research leadership by African researchers, strengthening of climate services, increasing climate literacy, increasing climate finance, both for readiness of projects, but especially implementation of projects. Next slide, please. An all of government approach that's inclusive, not just the job of the Environment Ministry, but right from finance through presidential commissions, legislation, ecosystem-based adaptation, working with nature, and finally working in a cross-sectoral way so that advances in one sector don't lead to trade-offs in other sectors. Next slide, please. So the evidence is clear. We know what to do. In many cases, we know how to do it, and the time for action is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Before having conversation, I would like to ask one of Edmond or Maruga, one of those who are remotely joining us, and then to have 2 or 3 minutes addition on issues they need to complement what has been already said. Edmond?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Can
you speak a bit louder? I know.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Yuba, and thanks, colleagues Chris, Deborah, and Felix. Yeah, this is a great opportunity to share some of the major outcome of the report. And as Chris or Felix already mentioned, so one of the major things that we can highlight is about loss and damage in Africa, mainly when we talk about food security and agriculture, which is a key sector in Africa, where we clearly indicate that 95% of food productions it is a rainfed in Africa. So the report clearly indicates major change that could happen under different scenario. And as Chris nicely mentions, yeah, it's now really time for actions because we have clear evidence that map how Africa could be affected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Edmond. Adunya is online.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I thank all the organizers, technical team who are on the ground, Deborah, all my colleagues with whom we have been engaged in the IPCC report since 2018. I'm very much delighted that this COP27 gave us an opportunity to talk to audiences. Thank you very much. My colleagues have presented very well. I have a small thing to add. One of the things I would like to include is Africa is the epicenter for climate change. If not, we are contributing to the emission. We are the most affected. And the two of the hotspots, 2 of the 7 hotspots globally vulnerable to climate change are in Africa. So I think the window of opportunity for African governments, development partners, civil society, researchers, people who are working for their community as a parliamentarian, representing the people in various ways, the window of opportunity to act the way Chris told us. We have solution. We are not people with no hope. We have hope and we have something to do. So the window of opportunity is very short. If we act on climate adaptation in short period of time, we may reverse and we can reduce some of the impacts. If not, it will be intergenerational effect, and the planet on which and the only which we rely on might not be livable. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Adunya, and thank you for joining us. If you want to intervene, just let us know at any moment, you will. I'm sure that Geladio will address the issue of health and nutrition. Geladio?
I can go also standing here. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I am Geladio Cissé. I am from the chapter 7, which is a sectoral chapter on health, well-being, and changing structures of community. We have heard here one of the regional chapters, the chapter on Africa. And in that chapter, they presented already some of the highlights of impacts of climate change on health in African context. Globally, if you look at all the continents, the chapter 7 has stated strongly, and it has been taken up at the level of the Centers for Policymakers, that the observation, the literature, the evidence is strong. It's a very high confidence level that is already observed. It's not something for the future, already observed, very important impact on the physical health of people all around the world, but also on mental health of people in regions where it has been assessed. One thing I would like to emphasize also is that the health impacts, and this is appearing strongly also in the chapter 7, they are coming at the cross of the superposition of vulnerabilities and exposure to different hazards. And the chapter has been able to show very strongly, and you have seen it on the slides, that with regard to vulnerability, Africa is presenting some characteristics that are really explaining why the impacts are strong there, even if in the literature or in the research, we are lacking fund. It is intuitively evident that when you say impacting globally, it's impacting most probably in most vulnerable regions, and Africa is one of these. If you look at infectious diseases, be it malaria, be it dengue, be it diarrheal disease, cholera has been mentioned. If you look at non-communicable diseases, be it chronic diseases, cardiovascular diseases linked, for instance, to heat mortality and morbidity. If you look at malnutrition and children particularly, even if there are scarce, the evidence is also there that Africa is also one continent having a lot of impacts on health. So I think I will stop there, just emphasizing on the numbers that have been presented to you so far, that both for communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases, the impacts of health in Africa are really important.
Thank you, Geladio. Deborah, I know that you have an eagle view. That means the eagle can see what we don't see. And I know also that you will be focusing on urban issues. If you can just highlight those urban issues and then the eagle view.
Thanks, Yuba, and thank you everyone for attending this particular event. If you're wondering where you're going to get all this incredibly valuable information from, referred to the Working Group 2 report, but we've also produced an easy to access booklet which has all this information in it, and easier to carry around potentially than the Working Group 2 report. And my colleague Marlies, who will raise her hand, has copies of this booklet for you, so please don't leave until you've taken a copy with you. So as Yuba said, I'm well known for my strong promotion of Africa's cities as a way to affect global change. We're rapidly urbanizing. We do not have the lock-in of other continents. There's an enormous opportunity to bend the curve by creating cities that have energy efficient, renewable energy. And Yuba has been a strong champion consistently across the continent for this. We've also got the opportunity to improve resilience in our urban areas by new forms of planning and design, the incorporation of nature in our cities. So we've got enormous opportunity in Africa's cities, but how do we harness that? You've heard a lot, I'm sure, if you've been following conversations during the COP about multi-level governance. We sit here in international negotiations, but the people who will drive that change, will build the green cities, the resilient cities, are local government. And so really there's a lot of probing of institutional change, policy change, governance change that's also reflected in the assessment. And we mustn't lose sight of that. It's as important to change those systems as it is to change the energy systems, to change the water systems. And that's really important because we change the governance systems, we can welcome everyone to the table. It's absolutely critical from an equity and justice point of view that we start to draw the marginalized and the vulnerable to the table to help us take decision. Those almost 60% of our urban population who live in informal settlements, when do we see them in City Hall? They need to be there. Women, youth, the elderly, indigenous groups, those need to be welcomed into our governance system. So those are important messages. The eagle eye view that Yuba asked from me is, I think we must see Africa as the determinant of the global future in the 21st century. You know, all too often, Africa is cast as a continent deep with troubles, deep with challenges. In fact, the huge opportunity to turn the globe around exists in Africa. And I think we must own that opportunity. We must drive it as Africans. We must be firm that the agenda must be ours. It must respond to our local context and our local needs. It must involve Africans in meaningful ways. We can't have research where research on our own continent comes down to people coming in from Europe and the US to understand African problems, to propose solutions to Africans. It must be Africans who own that agenda. And I think we, as part of this process of enormous change, need to change our mindset as Africans. We, in fact, need to lead because it's our opportunities that will change the globe. So really use the science, use it bravely, use it proudly, step to the front of the queue as Africans, because really this century is ours. We will turn the course of history if we turn the course of our continent around. Thanks, Yuba.
Okay, now, thank you, Deborah. Elam, I know that you could not miss this event, and then you made everything to be here with us. If you can bring some of the elements and then to complement or to deeper look at what the colleagues have not yet said.
First of all, let me welcome you all in Egypt, and I hope you enjoy the stay in my country. I'm very much happy to speak about Africa, which is our beloved continent, but it's very difficult to speak after Deborah, to be honest. But let me talk about the northern part of the Africa, which I came from. Actually, we need to look at these countries because, yes, the whole countries of the Mediterranean are facing the same risks, but the southern part are at very high risk, at very vulnerable to many impacts. For example, if you are talking about the sea level rise, for example, we are expecting to have like 1 meter by 2000. 7.5 centimeter come from the sea level rise, but again, we have another 2.5 centimeter come from other impact with land subsidence. The delta, which is the main agricultural part of my country, which you are hoping, like waiting for 12% of the GDP from agriculture, are facing a lot of vulnerability because of sea level rise, which will inundate an area, for example, for 1,500 square kilometer to up to 2,600 kilometers square. This area could be inundated at the end of this century if we are keep having the sea level rise. One more problem again from the sea level rise is the sea salt intrusions, which will affect dramatically the coastal aquifer in Egypt and in all the southern countries of the Mediterranean and the North Africa, I mean. And this will affect the agriculture, affect the water deficit, which will expecting to have from 30 to 50% deficit by the end of this century as well. And you know, Egypt and other countries in Africa are on the top of the people facing water problem. And I think that, as Chris said, this is the time for action. And I think action need two main pillars. The first is the financial support, which we are hoping that this conference will sort this out. And the second is the governors. We need to have laws. We need to have governors structure, not only international and regional, but also we need to have it downscale to the local region. I hope I covered this.
Okay, thank you.
Much.
Thank you for this first round. Before turning to the audience, I want to challenge you. You spent 6 years intense work on number of issues. And then you came up with number of elements. And then you said that because I do not know anything on climate issues, but sometimes when I read the news and I look at the television, and climate in Africa is associated with, you know, vulnerability, impact, and so on and so forth. Should we continue to have the same discourse? If yes, why? But you bring some new element. And then this is the first time, at least in the IPCC Working Group 2 report, the concept of climate resilient development. That means there is some hope. And then all of you said there is opportunities. Do we really have opportunities? And then who will want to take?
Well,
You are the one who said that there is opportunity.
Yes, we have a number of opportunities, but I think one of the key words that I think Chris mentioned is that we have opportunities, but the windows are closing. So while we have opportunities, windows are closing. And
why the windows are closing? You have to elaborate.
Thank you.
Because
So,
I don't know anything on climate
thank you
issues.
so much. So when you talk of the windows are closing, with increased global warming, some of the opportunities that we currently have may not be feasible moving forward. So what that means is that any delayment will be catastrophic. This is why the last slide that Chris ended with was the time to act is now. So we have a couple of opportunities under CRRD Climate Resilient Development, but these opportunities will actually close if we don't act quickly.
This is too broad. You want to? Yes, please, and then Chris.
Yes,
Because there's no window here. You said the
want-
windows are closing.
I want to take the example of health to just say, why do we have some opportunities to go forward? First, it's a continent where the traditional health systems are not yet, how can I say, somewhere where changes are not possible. There are many boxes that are empty where relevant policies could still come in and feed. The second opportunity that I see is that the initiatives at global level, the global health collaboration is showing a changing happening with particularly the WHO playing a major role. You have heard most probably that WHO has launched at COP26 one initiative called the Ministries of Health commitment for health. And this is now supported by some funding agencies to support countries to elaborate the health national adaptation plans. And the WHO has elaborated some frameworks, and the synthesis or fact sheets from IPCC are feeding very often the national dynamics around the evidence, even in countries where you have not yet enough evidence, the research is weak, some data are missing. These kind of initiatives are coming up to help people to really engage in gathering data, assessing vulnerabilities and capacities, and going for health national adaptation plans. For me, this is a big opportunity.
Chris?
I'll be brief, but I think a thing that gives me a reason for optimism and hope, especially in this report, is it identifies so many places where the co-benefits are much bigger than the trade-offs. I think we often talk about climate action and we think, okay, maybe there are trade-offs for employment or the economy and short-term pain for long-term gain when we talk about emissions reductions. And I think especially this Working Group 2 report shows, and Working Group 3, how often that's not the right way to think about it. The synergies are far more numerous than the trade-offs. For example, changing from wood fuel-based bioenergy for cooking to clean electrified cook stoves improves indoor air pollution, it reduces it, it improves health, mostly for women, it reduces deforestation, which benefits biodiversity and carbon stores and helps prevent further global warming. There are other examples around having balanced diets in Africa, around improving access to electricity in cities, which can create jobs. It can also mean that those cities are powered by renewables. It can also create jobs in the renewables sector. In addition, in places like health, Africa is already in a position where as we develop our cities further, you can develop them for more active mobility, such as walking and cycling, which can lead to healthier lives, fewer deaths from local air pollution. So by some estimates, the avoided costs or the benefits from a strong mitigation pathway globally, just in terms of avoided deaths from near surface air pollution, almost completely offsets the cost of the transition to renewables, even not accounting for the future climate change, right? So there are huge opportunities here for multiple wins in terms of health, education, climate, having a safe and stable climate, as well as for biodiversity. Thanks.
Deborah? Or do you want to make the question much more complicated and complex?
No, I don't. But I do want to point out that we shouldn't shy away from the vulnerability narrative of Africa. It's the product of a historical development path that needs to be challenged. And in fact, we could get more vulnerable. There could be higher impacts on this continent. We already have high levels of poverty, marginalization. We need to own that. We need to embrace that because we need to drive the change that will drive a change in the global system. Because Africa needs to be enabled to harness the opportunities that Chris has spoken about. And that must come with international support. It must come with appropriate finance so that we can bring the poor out of poverty, that the marginalized are welcome to the table, that harnessing the health opportunities and the co-benefits is something that we can do. And so multilateralism is absolutely vital. There's an obligation in the multilateral system to look to the vulnerable, to provide that support. And I think we must own that because the potential for us not getting that support creates an almost unlivable future in many parts of our continent. Where I live in South Africa, that region is heating twice as fast as the rest of the world. You know, in a country like Egypt, increases in temperature could make places unlivable. People might not be able to work outdoors. Livestock may not be able to be kept. And so the stakes are high. And we mustn't only look to ourselves. Obviously, we've got great ingenuity, great commitment, but we must look to global cooperation and we must hold people accountable. There's a history on this continent and people must be accountable for that history and provide the help that allows us to create a more just and equitable society. So let's not lose sight of that. There is an accountability. Without multilateralism, we will not be able to harness much of the opportunity that is Africa.
Okay, I want also, I want to bring also those who are remotely there. Each of you indicated clearly different sectors, the health, the agriculture, water, and so on and so forth, education, everything. But the point is that, how can we, and then Chris, you insist on action. We need to act now. But the problem is the climate is at the end of the Minister of Environment. And then all those different elements you indicated is not on the hand of the Minister of Environment. And then how it might be possible, and then to bring the governance issue, because you have not elaborated the governance issue. You touch a bit on education, but this is very important. And then how that will work, and then to make reality some of the elements you just indicated. Those are some of the issues we can do, and it's possible. Who want to come in from the remote, Edmond?
Yes, I can come in. Thank you, Yuba, for this opportunity. Yeah, I fully
Can you speak
agree.
a bit louder, because this
Yeah,
people are shouting.
Yeah, please, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. So I fully agree with what Deborah just mentions. So we should try a bit to move away from this vulnerability rhetoric. In Africa, we also have to highlight the value of our local knowledge, local indigenous knowledge, where we can see that in many communities, our communities, they just look at the weather and can say whether we can expect rain in the coming hours, and those things happen. It's also part of the governance. So how we can embrace this type of knowledge, how we can value them in our adaptation plan. We see one of the major gaps that my colleague maybe didn't highlight is the coverage of rain forecast stations and the accuracy of the type of information we can get from those infrastructure. But how can we use also this potential of local knowledge? It can be part of the governance narrative. Also, we clearly see that the focus in most of our countries is on local and sometimes a national plan. And Chris rightly mentioned it. Our adaptation process are sometimes very fragmented, but we needed to move beyond the national boundaries and look at inter-sectorial intervention, but also inter-countries interventions. One of the typical example is coastal erosion, when we can see each country tries to focus and design intervention to cope or deal with this at national level. But it's just pushing the problems on neighbors' door. So those are things we should promote, how we work across countries, how we work across sectors. What is affecting agriculture can have implication on health, on education, and on livelihood. So we should, this is the kind of thing we should promote. Yeah.
Thank you. Adunya?
Thank you very much. I would like to tackle 2 points. The first point is to complement the health issue my colleague in the hall mentioned, especially the opportunities in the health. I would like to highlight on that because I don't want to put the audience and maybe people who are going to take this message to their sector, to the health sector, to be full of hope. Especially WHO is mentioned. WHO has brought up the climate resilient health system into account, in which there are components which are dealing with the capacity of the health system. That means it embraces the 6 building blocks of the health system. And that is one of the opportunities that we can take. And the Ministry of Health could take the climate resilient health system into their programming. We can take example. The health system is also a source of carbon emission, and how do they plan to reduce the carbon emission in the health system from the diagnostics they are using, from the system. There are emissions, so Do they know amount of emission they have? And do they have a plan on how to reduce that emission? And the other thing is how to respond to the health emergencies happening due to climate extremes, events like flooding, so on and so forth. The second thing I would like to mention about climate resilience is whether that climate resilient is environmentally sustainable in the healthcare system. And let me move to the second point, which is mentioned by the first presenter, Professor Felix, about the disproportionate distribution of health impacts of climate. There is variability in the society, in the countries, along regions, along the sub-regions. If you take East Africa is going to have more malaria, more dengue in the coming century. So what do we mean when we say window of hope? I'm sure most of you or some of you might have experienced missing a flight. That means after the plane has closed its window, there is no way the security will allow you to get on board. That means you are told from the ground, no, the time is up. Your window of opportunity is the time that you have to be at the security with your passport and the document at the right time, okay? So we have less than a decade time to act on the vulnerabilities, the risks, and to address those things. Still we have opportunity because there are development agenda, Africa 2063 agenda. African Union has declared 2022 as the year of food insecurity. So all those policy issues are window of opportunity for us to address our case. So social determinants of health, if we bring the ecosystem into account, the environmental issues into our account, the animal health, the human health into account, and we approach the planetary health, One Health approach, all those things, there are guidelines available nowadays, evidence is available nowadays. So all those things are opportunity for me to bring to our people, our policymakers, for them to guide us through adaptation to climate change. Thank you. I
Okay,
might have taken more time. I'm sorry for that.
Thank you. Now they said that they are warm and they are ready to take any challenging questions. It's up to you. Are you convinced with what you have heard, or do you have any question? I really hope that we'll have an interaction. And then who wants to start? Don't be afraid. They said that they are warm. They are willing to take any question. There's no taboo. Who wants? This is not possible.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for your hello, everybody. It's Amal Nagar from Egypt, the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I'd like to add to what you have said in a perspective of the industrial side. In this issue, I think we have cooperation with South Africa towards the green economy. We have a platform, we are working on it, it's IOX, for exchanging the industrial waste on this platform. Also, we have many we have also keen on working on the green entrepreneurship. This is from the perspective of industrial side, and this is what I'd like to say from the industrial side. Thank you.
Thank you. Who else want to? This is not possible. Okay, excellent. Because I can be much more tough with them. I prefer that you deal with that.
Hi, Mashal Al-Fardan from DP World. My question is, what sectors would you like the private sector to focus on? So coming into Africa and being involved with, the different communities, different environmental agencies, what are the key focus areas? Where should we be putting our money?
I want some other question. This is noted. Who want to come in? I see some people have taken a lot of notes. You cannot be taking notes without any question. It's not possible. Yes.
Hi, Rachel. Oh, is that loud enough? Rachel James from the UK. Could you say a bit about where you think the priorities for research and science are? And also, I really appreciate the point made by Deborah about the importance of Africa-led research. And do you have any thoughts about how partners outside of the continent can best kind of support that? Thanks.
Yes, in the back. Now the audience is warming a bit.
That's Roland from South Africa. First question, the length of time you take to do your research, do you often find that by the time you're preparing your report, some of the data is already too old to be included? And second question, I don't know if it was Deborah or someone who was doing presentations at the South African Presidential Climate Change Commission. Are there other countries where you also doing your presentations at the really highest level? Because we often find that many of our leaders really reject the science, and there's still a very high level of reticence to use science to develop policy. South Africa has embraced the IPCC researchers at the highest level. Do we see that it's a trend that is spreading?
Thank you. Just one element, IPCC is not doing research, is assessing. Yeah. This just to correct, but your question is still valid. But one important element, I think that you have to take that. You said that the governments are not considering research. This is very important. That means your report is not relevant for the government. I think that those are some of the elements. So we have three sets of questions. One, address the issue of private sector. Second, address the issue of the importance of research. And then the last question, is your assessment still valid because it started 6 years ago? And then how government are taking in consideration the element. You also, mostly you have to think about it. Okay, who want to take?
I can speak briefly to the private sector question and then invite other panelists to add their thoughts on that as well. There is a need for a multiple-fold increase in funding for both adaptation and mitigation in Africa. And at the moment, that funding is not available from within African governments and the public sector internationally. So there's absolutely a crucial role for the private sector. So far, where that funding has flowed in, it's largely been to mitigation around renewables projects. And a lot of that is because there are easier financial models for a direct revenue stream to return on that. Where there is more of a challenge, but an even more of a need, is for financing in adaptation. And so I think it's really something that is urgent, is for linking up work between the public sector, the private sector, academia, to work out what financial models can yield the types of returns on the private sector that lead to adaptation benefits. And one of the challenges there is a lot of the adaptation need in Africa is around low-income communities, marginalized communities, and often the returns on those investments are large, multiple benefits to the costs that go in, but they're often quite diffuse and they're returned as public goods. And there isn't an easy way that the private sector sees to kind of turn that into a direct revenue stream. And so that's a major challenge for us in an African context, and something that needs a lot of collaboration and a lot of work very urgently. Thanks.
Thank you. Who want to come in?
I would like just to respond to the importance of research, because this is very
Can
tricky.
you get a microphone?
It's a very important point for me, because if I speak about the Mediterranean region again, and the IPCC report, we were assessing all the research we've done. But we faced a problem because we find that the research in the southern area is very poor. And I'm petty to say that, but this is the reality. And we're trying to generalize the research have been done in the north to be in the whole area, which is not fair, because the northern part is different than the southern part. So it's very important to give finance specifically for research. And I'm very much happy that talking about local and indigenous knowledge is being underlined sorry, in this report, because this is the first time from my background to talk about the indigenous knowledge and how much this very local knowledge will affect even the information and the climate change impacts. So I'm very important to have the research, and I'm very much inviting my country, for example, and even when we are trying to put the strategy for climate change was just emerged, and it is for 2050. And we try to put a big sector for research and to advocate some more money for research, which was not available before.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Many of the questions are interconnected. It was mentioned the issue of lack of data. Lack of data is linked to the weakness of research. And then you don't have data, you can't have good projects. Many investors can't invest in something that they don't know the reality of it. And then the government not playing the kind of role model showing that it is interested in this is like a loop that is just keeping the things in place. So I agree with you that the government's role on giving a lot of interest to research is crucial. But we are doing our best. You have also an international work going on. But now for the updates of data, it depends on the strength of the research capacities in the country. But as a level of assessment, anytime you decide to just make like a photo of what is the evidence in your country and what IPCC is doing, many people don't know how serious it is, how work it's behind it. If you try to find out what has been done from time 1 to time 2 in the different countries, it's a hard task. No one else is doing it. Sometimes people are just running around their own researches and running, but no one is sitting and saying what evidence is coming from all this, what is happening. And it has to follow a systematic, a logical way, very coherent one, independent one. This is a very tough work. So anytime a report comes out saying from this term A to this term B, this is what I found, it's an update. You can't find nothing more update than that. Even if it says it's on 5 years or it's for 10 years or for 8 years. This is what IPCC work is about. So I don't know if I responded to the question. Thank you.
Let me just two additions. I think there was a question on whether other African countries are pitching scientific evidence at a high level, like the case of South Africa. But obviously, the case is that's not the case in all the countries within Africa. You realize that a number of countries do not even have maybe a national position where maybe at the district level, they look at their climate profile and then come up with what needs to be done. So I think this is something that needs to be enhanced. There was a question on research. One of the challenges, one of the hats that I wear is I work for the university. The challenge we have is that funding is very poor. Then secondly, you have to collaborate with other partners. So today you'll be working with a partner who is interested in a specific area of research, and you do that. Then the other day you'll be working on something else, and the other day on something else. So at the end of the day, we don't seem to actually build evidence in one area. When you look at also PhD research is also quite poor within Africa, because you find that we have very few PhD students driving research. So I think we need to look at that. There was a question on where can the private sector come in. I think Chris handled that, but I'd like to add to the fact that all the sectors, I think there's need for awareness of the impact of climate change across the sectors. I once was working with civil engineers, and it was quite interesting. I asked them how climate change was affecting them, and then they said climate change is not affecting us. And I had to have a lot of patience with them. So I asked them to say, so if you had any bridges collapsing, then they said, yeah. What could be the reason? Poor workmanship. Okay, if you had floods, yeah. So if you have floods, would that affect water flow? Yes. Would that affect erosion? Yes. So we need a lot of patience actually to help all these other sectors to see the link between climate change and what they are doing. Otherwise, on the face value, they are kind of detached.
I just want to make a couple of quick comments. Investment, the urban infrastructure, huge opportunity to get that right and done differently. Research, stop treating us as data collectors, treat us as principal investigators in your teams. The length of time it takes to produce the IPCC reports is necessary because, as Gulade indicated, 195 governments would not trust them otherwise. They're a unique opportunity to build trust around science and create peer pressure to make those changes. I work with policymakers in my day-to-day life. The reason they don't engage with climate change, can you read 4,000 pages of report? That's the Working Group 2 report. It's a doorstop. We've got to produce material that gets it into the policy space. As I said, we've been working on that. We're producing videos. Yuba himself was involved at a very high level at an AMCEN meeting taking this, but you've got to take it in a way that policymakers who've got 2 seconds to listen to you can pick up on your key messages and work with it. So let's not just blame the policymakers. We're not producing material they can use in an easily accessible way. So the culpability is as much on the science side as it is on the policy side. We need to own that.
Yes. Question here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Siri Eriksson. I'm also an IPCC Working Group 2 author. So I have a comment that I wondered whether the panel could also reflect on. I think a key issue with climate resilient development is who decides what climate resilient development looks like for whom. I think it speaks to some of the questions that we've discussed now about knowledge politics as well. But for example, Deborah, you mentioned inclusive governance and bringing marginalized groups to the table and so on. I mean, would the rest of the panel want to expand on how do we ensure processes where actually those, that we get an equitable process of deciding what climate resilient looks like, climate resilient development looks like for actually those groups who we are meant to support, so that it becomes an equitable process. And perhaps you have examples from Africa or even some of the challenges. Thank you.
I just want to take a number of questions. Is there any other questions? The audience? So they are beating you. Okay.
I'll be very brief, and it links back to the private sector series. So it's only a partial answer to the question. And it's, I think, in terms of climate resilience, something we perhaps haven't talked about enough in this IPCC report, but it's there, is the role of the private sector in fostering that kind of climate resilience and what it looks like. It's not just a public sector thing, and particularly their potential role in a lot of enabling conditions, such as around promoting climate change literacy, through investing in education, aspects of more creative financing models that allow more low-income people to access finance or be insured against climate shocks, investment in information infrastructure such as hydrometeorological stations, and making that data available to innovators who can work with those data systems to develop early warning services. So I think that's a key part of climate resilience that we haven't perhaps talked about enough in these reports, but where there's a large opportunity for the private sector in Africa. And I'll hand to others for the deep answers.
Yeah, so putting on my local government hat, I think it's really important if we think about the poor and vulnerable, they don't have a great deal of time to ponder climate change science. And so I think the way of bringing people to the table is through interventions that create opportunities for upliftment, improvement in life, job creation, that allow people to understand that this kind of response is in their best interest. And that mobilizes people. You know, speaking to people about climate change just as is in a context of high vulnerability and poverty is not going to enable them to demand their right at the table. And that's the problem, is we need to help mobilize people by creating the opportunities Chris is talking to, because that begins to change the political narrative. My politicians are very keenly aware that every 5 years votes are cast. And if those votes are taken away from them because they're not adhering to the kind of demands that are coming from society, they're very alive to that. But we've got to start creating conditions where people see value in this for their lives so they can begin to mobilize as well.
I think I'd like to make a comment on the question on who decides on climate resilience development. I think that's a tricky question, but I think it's something that we need to collectively think through as countries. Recently, in a country that I will not mention, a climate resilient road was washed away. So there are a lot of things, standards, and so I think these are conversations that we actually need to actually have moving forward.
Okay, any other questions? So you want me to replace the audience? I'm supposed to be only moderating.
But
Yes.
sorry, Yuba,
Debra. Huh? Yes,
this
because
is,
I have not seen your hand. Who want to intervene? Yes. Okay. Debra, just 1 second. Yeah. Yes, you are muted.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Well, I also want to reflect on this point that Siri made, and I would say that it's very important to look for inclusive process, inclusive climate resilience development process. And for me, I think it calls first of all communications. It called for the language we use. If we want to work together with local community, if we want to work with policymakers, so what type of language we use, how we communicate with those people so that they don't see any kind of barriers to how we set the scene for them also to step in. The second thing is about the scope. How we address, we work on people's aspiration and expectation, or with people's priorities or what they are dealing with. So it's really not about working or designing a plan for people, but it's about how we design this plan with people at different level. And finally, I would say that it's called for both processes, top down, with coming from policy mechanism, but also bottom up, starting from the grassroots. What are people experiencing? What are the challenges? And I think going through those different mechanisms can show the interest and engage the local community. That can be a way to look for more inclusive mechanism.
Thank you. Adunya?
Thank you very much. I want to reflect on one of the previous questions and small thing on the current question. The first thing is, what is the priority sector you are going to take first? I think this is the time when we have to focus on transformative adaptation. That means we have to move from climate variability adaptation to climate change adaptation. So if we take that into account, climate change is a long-term impact. So it takes the development issues into account. So I think I can take example for this one. If we do good things like in agriculture, if we ensure food security, that means this is going to also help the health sector to have a productive and a prosperous community who is healthy enough and strong enough to produce and to have a good health and well-being. And this is going to be very important. The other thing is about the timing of the research or assessment. I think this research, this assessment took 2 more years or 1.5 years because of COVID. I think that is a great opportunity for us to experience COVID while we are writing this report, because we learned a lot of things. We haven't mentioned COVID so far. So by experiencing COVID, we have learned how resilience is very important. If the health system is resilient enough, surveillance, tracing of cases, all things will be easier for the health system. So I think we have to focus on those things. I think I have to stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I think that we are almost at the end. If there is a burning question, you can just, okay. If there is no burning question, I just want to ask if there is any magic, because you mentioned the issue of loss and damage. Those who are familiar with the COPs, that was a taboo word in the COP. What has been the magic that infiltrated? This one aspect. Second aspect, I remember in Yokohama, for the approval of the Working Group 2 report, the African was furious because in the SPM, there were no mention of desertification and drought. Because is there any magic? Because the response of the author said that the evidence, there is no literature that bring the evidence relationship to climate. And in this report, you bring many different elements. What has been the magic?
One quick answer to that is in this IPCC report, you'll find stronger evidence than in any previous report on loss and damage attributable to human-induced climate change that has happened in Africa. And that's right across sectors from economies to fisheries to crops to other types of agriculture, biodiversity, water systems, energy. And as a quick plug, we have fact sheets here. There's Luxon at the back with postcards, and that information. So like Deborah said, you don't have to read the 4,000-page report. We've summarized it for each sub-region of Africa: North, South, East, West, Central, and in English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic. And there are postcards at the back with a QR code where you can find a lot of that information. I'd hand to other panelists if there's a magic thing about the report they'd like to highlight.
I think that sums it up really nicely.
I know that some of the audience, they said they have no pen, they have no paper because it's a paper smart COP. I just want each of you to give to them one word as a takeaway message. Each of you, each of the panelists, just one word. Okay, let me start with Edmond. Edmond?
Yes, mine is a hope.
Hope. Adunya?
Opportunity.
Opportunity. Geladio?
Commitment.
Commitment.
Let me go with the solutions.
Working, just working. We have to work.
Cities.
Mine would be energy.
Thank you. So that you have some keyword. No, it has been impressive. And then please take the material, and then you can go also to, you can get the website. There is a wealth of information, and then you can use it for those who are doing research, those who are informing policymakers, those who are supporting action on the ground. And it's a fantastic team, a fantastic report. And then for the first time, we had a very solid African report in the IPCC assessment throughout of the dedication and hard work that has been done. And let us give a big hand to the panelists, and thank you for. Okay, and thank you for staying with us. And then you have some reward. This is the booklet, and then you can get a booklet. No, back.
Thank you, Aduna.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great meeting you again.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Thank you very
Yeah,
much. Have a
yeah,
nice time.
yeah,
Greeting to
same.
your family.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone that's joining online. We'll be starting shortly. Just bear with us for a couple of minutes.
event. Today, the purpose, before I get to the purpose, my name is Khaurelo Mkumbeni. I am a member of the South African Youth Policy Committee, and I am also an active participant in the programs at Youth at SAYA in South Africa. Today, the purpose of the event, before I get to, sorry, I'd like to acknowledge everyone that is in the room. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here to listen to what the young people of South Africa have to say. Today is a very, very pivotal day to this period of us being at COP. So I really, really do acknowledge your presence and I thank you for being here. So today is a day that we will be acknowledging the role that young people have been playing in South Africa in different policy processes. And we will be doing this in acknowledging their role in policy making, in policy implementation, as well as in activism and activism. So today, we are acknowledging that young people are not just young and passive, but we are active. We are constantly working towards resolving the issues that we face within our country. So our guests here today will express that to you, that all of our actions that we've been taking have brought us here today. All of the impact that we've had in South Africa have brought us here to COP to really, really show what the world, what we have been doing in our country. So to begin our event, we have been also working on a project with UNICEF South Africa around climate work, and we are so excited to announce that we have Paloma Escudero, who is a member of UNICEF. We'll now get to her bio right now, but really I want to move on to her as the first speaker because she will be speaking on global advocacy within UNICEF and the work that we as the Youth at SAYA network have been participating in. So the work that we first did with UNICEF was actually the advocacy guide, which has become a big global resource for young people in policy. So I really like to welcome her by mentioning her work as well. Paloma Escudero is the director of the Division of Global Communications and Advocacy at UNICEF. She was appointed as a director in 2013 in April. So with her extensive experience and expertise in communications, fundraising, advocacy, and brand management, she oversees UNICEF's global public outreach and communications as its senior communication official. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocol observed, I would like to welcome Paloma Escudero. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's very special, I think, for UNICEF to be joining this, this amazing group of young people. And it's very special because, as you said, really these young people working for many hours, many days, many months with the UNICEF team in South Africa, developed the global advocacy guidance for UNICEF. They didn't develop the advocacy guidance for climate. They didn't develop only the advocacy guidance for how youth should be engaged. They really, UNICEF, that we are an organization that we say we want to be powered by children and young people, gave the leading role, gave the pen to these amazing brains in the room and asked them if during a year they could be producing the guidance on how UNICEF should be the voice, should be the advocate for children's rights all around the world, and how the UNICEF advocacy had to be shaped through the voices of young people. I think our expectations were big, but the outcome just blown us away. So much that what was going to be initially UNICEF advocacy guidance for South Africa, I can say that now, after COVID, has become, in 2022, our global guidance for advocacy in UNICEF. So for me, this is really youth at the center of advocacy, and youth not only being at the spotlight of our programs, of our work, being an integral partner of our day-to-day. And this is thanks to the collaboration and also, I would say, to the leadership of the youth advocates in South Africa. And I think also perhaps was also part of the work we did to make sure that the South Africa delegation to COP27 had a high representation of youth advocates of the one we have today. So I really want to be praising, no, to be sending a huge bravo. And today, as we celebrate happy Youth Day at COP27, to be really doing so using the African youth delegates, African youth advocates as the role model for many other climate youth activists around the world. So I stop here because the people we really need to listen to today are the people on my left. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that incredible insight as to what has happened with the UNICEF advocacy guide. So this really shows and reflects the role that young people have played globally in championing climate action. So my next speaker, in fact, my next segment will be on policy participation, and we'll be sharing stories on the local, national, and global climate action through policy participation and processes in South Africa. So the following speakers will be speaking on the first ever National Youth Climate Action Plan that was created by the very same young people you see here today. So my first speaker will be Sibusiso Mazomba, who is an SA Youth Delegate to South Africa here at COP, and he will be touching more on the policy participation of young people in South Africa. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sibusiso Mazomba, a member of the Youth Policy Committee at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and also was, part of the process of drafting the policy. So I just wanted to share a bit more on the work that we have been doing in the past 2 years. So the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan is a product of the lived experiences of young people from across the city of Johannesburg who saw a critical need for there to be more responsive approaches to the climate crisis. Localizing climate change policies while adopting an intersectional and bottom-up approach to climate action was at the core of our agenda. And the crisis, we realized, and as we've seen, in the past year, with climate disasters happening in all four corners of our world, the climate crisis is here with us now and threatens to hit those who are most underprivileged and most vulnerable in our communities. And so if we do not act with greater urgency and create policies that are underpinned by the acknowledgement of vulnerability and differential adaptive capacities of different groups in society, that was critical to the work that we did. And so we sought to ensure that the non-neutrality of climate impacts on these groups and communities was recognized and efforts be made to ensure that climate justice is accounted for in adapting to climate change impacts in the city. And so young people from across South Africa, especially in grassroots communities, came together to work on an integrated and an intersectional climate action oriented approach, which were underpinning principles to combating climate change, that is part of the document that we created. And so the response of our leaders to the emergency has been very slow and long-winded, with no clear commitment to the solutions that are already there. And so we recognize that underprivileged communities and marginalized groups would need to be included in decision-making processes, as the principle of subsidiarity requires that those who are closest to the problem be the ones who are responsible and who are part of the solution. And at its core, climate change presents itself to be an issue of a deep divide between poor countries and rich countries, and the poor people and the rich people in those countries. And so it's a hierarchical crisis that shines a light on the very rigid and political and economic inadequacies which our world stands on and threatens to punish those who are most disadvantaged. And as custodians of the world of tomorrow, and as the first generation that would have to bear with the almost inevitable impacts of the crisis, it was vital that we were at the forefront of climate discourse and lead conversations and actions that would be effective in turning the tide on our current trajectory of reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. And so youth participation in policymaking has to be the bedrock to catalyze that action. And this was one of the main aims of the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan. Its aims, next slide, please. Okay, that's the slide, yes. Its aims was to ensure that the voices of young people are heard and that their perspectives were not seen as additives to climate change discourse, but rather integral to it. And so the document is a culmination of the vigor and the commitment of young grassroots activists to ensure that we shift from the current model that is very carbon intensive and that our society hinges on, to one that is more sustainable and provides a framework for building enhanced adaptive capacity to the most vulnerable and marginalized in our communities. And so this meant that we had to recognize that social justice and climate justice are inextricably linked and cannot be seen as distinct parts, as to ensure that the smallest contributors of emissions, again, do not have to pay the highest price and bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And so partnering with officials and policymakers from the city of Johannesburg on the Climate Action Plan was a crucial step to achieving this. There's often a disconnect between grassroots communities who are witnessing the crisis at ground zero and the decision makers who are making the decisions. And so we as young people are lobbying on the ground in our communities so to bridge this gap, but by not only demonstrating that we have the capacity to be active proponents in drafting policy that is implementable and aligned to scientific fact, but also bringing a people focus to the table, which is a lens that is often absent in most policies. Next slide, please. So intersectionality was an underpinning principle of the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan. The YCAP primarily composes of 6 key pillars that include systemic change, the just transition, leadership and advocacy, innovation, and accessibility and sustainability. Next slide, please. And so intersectionality as an underpinning principle for the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan came with the aim to envision an inclusive society that prioritizes the collective success of communities and adopts an integrated and sustainable approach to tackling prevailing socioeconomic inequalities. We call for representation of different marginalized groups in decision-making through fostering research in order to understand their unique vulnerabilities and differential impacts to climate change on youth, women, and other vulnerable groups in our societies. And this is important now more than ever because we understand that the city is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And Johannesburg has a diverse range of communities that have differential resilience and will therefore require different strategies for building resilience and tackling effects of climate change in those communities. And so in the implementation of this Youth Climate Action Plan, it's important that these strategies are informed by and are tailor-made for the challenges and approaches at every stage of implementation. Furthermore, non-formal climate education resources, we called for those to be developed together with communities and dedicated task groups for disseminating these education resources around the city. And the outcomes from this process highlight the potential for cities to collaborate with young people in the synthesis and implementation of policy frameworks. We partnered with UNICEF South Africa to allow young people to be active stakeholders in the implementation of the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan. And I've started working together with the city to develop a Youth Climate Ambassadors Leadership Program in the city. And so the YCAP is a living document, and we are continuously working on it while also working with youth across South Africa to actualize it. And youth are leading now. Youth are demonstrating that we are committed to not only calling for change, but learning and working on the full policy process to actualize that change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sibusiso. It seems like the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan was a great segue for young people to get involved in policy in South Africa. So the next speaker will be Celiwe Shivambu. Celiwe is a youth delegate of South Africa here at COP, and she will be also touching on the South African Youth Climate Action Plan. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to use this to time myself. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today at the South African Pavilion. And thank you to Kgaugelo and Sibusiso for starting off the session. I'm briefly just going to be touching on the South African Youth Climate Action Plan. And as Sibusiso started off, we started the South African Youth Climate Action Plan came about right after we finished drafting the Johannesburg Climate Action Plan. And this came at the time when we asked for the city just to consult on their climate action plan. And the city actually offered offered us, a seat at the table, several of them, that we come and actually draft an entire chapter. And that on its own validated so much of our work as the young people at Youth at SAYA who have been commenting on a lot of policies and writing youth statements to government on climate change and the NDCs. And at that time, when we got to this opportunity, we thought, you know what, let's just ride with it. We already have the principles from the Joburg Youth Climate Action Plan. And now we can actually get together with other young people from all over the country, nationally, and actually come up with what could be termed and what is actually South Africa's first Youth Climate Action Plan. And the Youth Climate Action Plan is actually a living document, as Sibusiso has mentioned. And this is to reflect the views of young South Africans from across the country. And it stands on two essential things, really. This is a call to national stakeholders to honor their climate pledges. And it's also in a framework to inspire youth-led climate action for a just, sustainable, and resilient society. May I please have the next slide? The SA-YCAP process has been convened through youth programs at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And this was in partnership with various organizations and high schools and universities from across the country. And this document was handed over to officials from the Department of Forestry, Fishery and Environment, and also the Presidential Climate Commission at a special hybrid event that took place 1st of October 2021 at Freedom Park in Pretoria in South Africa. And what really started what is now the SA-YCAP process was our first submission of the NDC submission in April. And this is where we basically, experienced or rather reiterated the South Africa we envision as young people. And from that submission, we then came up with what could be the pillars of the SA-YCAP. And what made up the pillars of the Youth Climate Action Plan were policy and advocacy and climate striking, the intergenerational dialogue and equity, meaningful youth engagement, COP26, and building resilience in communities, and having youth responsiveness and participation. And also, as my next speaker will touch on, the We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership. And as young people in South Africa, we saw the urgent need for accelerated climate action to build a climate resilient and a prosperous society. And this came shortly after the IPCC working group stated that it is undeniable that the human influence has warmed up the atmosphere and oceans and the land. And to limit the global warming goal and to even realize it as set in the Paris Agreement, it required a greater climate ambition from all sectors of societies, and young people were part of those. And in tackling climate action, we stress the obligation to uphold human rights with special emphasis on promoting intersectional and inclusive climate action. While the actions that were detailed in the document were to call upon the national stakeholders and also urge the global community to enhance their support for countries from the global south and to commit to global financing goals on adaptation and mitigation. young people from all over South Africa that were representing various organizations, schools and universities and communities had developed the SA-YCAP. And our number one goal in this framework was to ensure that it inspires youth-led actions and that it serves as a guide for youth decision makers and also civil society, businesses, and other stakeholders to reshape our country into a climate-just, resilient society. And we continued to applaud some of the work that has been done before us, such as the National Development Plan that was also quoted a number of times in the SA-YCAP, and also the nationally determined contributions, and also the climate change bill that was drafted in 2018. And the views was that we needed a good foundation to realize our vision that aligned with a sustainable, equitable, and inclusive, resilient futures for all. And these documents provided those for us. So we did not leave them behind in trying to envision the society that we wanted as young people in this country. And in South Africa, the SA-YCAP detailed the actions that need to be undertaken to realize this vision. And it lies on 5 core pillars, which is intersectionality, advocacy, and activism for climate action, good governance, systematic change, and environmental sustainability. And all of these pillars, were at the core of them is to ensure that there is climate justice, there's gender mainstreaming, and also inclusive action and advocacy as well. And the SA-YCAP came at a time where we were in the thick of COVID-19 and we had to host a number of consultations with young people from across the country. And as Kopano will mention about the social media and the digital divide in South Africa, we had to try our honest best to make sure that we consult with young people, whether they're in the rural parts of South Africa or in the township or also in the urban areas of South Africa, to ensure that this document actually describe what South African young people actually want. And it came from the consultations were a part of storytelling, where young people had to tell their stories and those stories had to form policy. So each and every sentence and each and every line in the SA-YCAP is a lived experience of young people in South Africa. And we continue to strive and to ensure that this living document will continue on forth and move forward to the implementation and hopefully the success of seeing it to come to life. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Celiwe. It's incredible to see that this living document is not just tailored to young people, but to all stakeholders in South Africa to join climate action and champion change in South Africa. So my next speaker is Teresa Zoon, who is a program developer for SDG Netherlands and Public Affairs for We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership. Please come and share your perspective.
Can I stay seated? Is that okay? I prefer talking sitting. I've been walking all day. I bet you do have as well. Yeah, I'm Teresa Zoons. I am from the Netherlands, but I'm not representing anyone Dutch here. I'm representing We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership, which is a platform for organizations just like Saya at Youth, youth movements who want to advocate and have a constructive conversation with their national leaders. We help these youth movements to formulate concrete climate ambitions and facilitate their national agendas of their climate action plans, as you call it, to bring that to an international level. And when it comes to facilitating these youth movements to write these agendas in the first place, that was not quite necessary with Saya at Youth. I think you were one of the first to do this in our partnership. So apparently the Johannesburg Climate Action Plan was also one of the first ever in South Africa. So I think we can say you're very good at pioneering. And for us, that has been really helpful because it was a great example for other youth organizations that we work with to see how it can be done, with an emphasis on how it can be done. Because of course, it really depends on cultural and political context, how these agendas can be formulated and developed in consultation with youth in these countries. That being said, South Africa is not the only country that now has a national vision document or a national youth climate agenda, as we call it. This process has been followed by other countries as well. Just to name a few, the Netherlands. Actually, the chair of the Dutch Youth Climate Movement is standing in the back there. That's also quite beautiful example, because they have already updated their youth climate agenda for the 3rd time this year. But then there's also Chile, Mexico, Uganda, very different countries that all formulated their national youth climate agendas to advocate towards their national leaders. Now, after having worked with these countries for 2 to 3 years, we felt that this work shouldn't go unnoticed on an international level. These are really, really good examples for other countries, but also very important input for international leaders to take into account when making international policy here at COP, for example, which is why we decided to combine all of this input into a global youth climate agenda. So this is where we're heading towards the international level. And we also started this whole process again with consultations with all of our partner organizations, those being the youth climate movements from the different countries that we work with. And we first had a round of written submissions, then a round of online consultations in which we asked ourselves 3 different questions. Well, not really ourselves, but the youth climate movements, of course. What is your dream? Was the first question. What do you vision for the future? What do you think a climate just future should look like? What's the world that you want to live in? And then the second question being, what are the problems that are keeping you from achieving this? Because that's what's in the way, right? Not our willingness to accomplish that. And then the third question is much more about, let me have a sneak peek there. What are then the solutions that we should prioritize in getting there? And the solutions I think were perhaps the most difficult part about developing this global youth climate agenda, because they are so much depending on the national context. But that was also the most interesting part, because there is definitely a red line between different countries that have a common vision for a climate just future. And that's exactly what we meant to capture in this global youth climate agenda. And the contribution of SAIA Youth was actually really interesting, because me being a Dutch person, I have a very different perception, I think, of what's necessary to solve climate change. And from SAIA Youth, I think me and my colleagues really learned how this is connected to social issues, and how the climate crisis is also very much a social crisis, rooted in societal inequality issues. So that is also really like a really important lesson for other youth organizations to learn from your national context, right? And that made us very happy as We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership, because it showed that the work we do is relevant and important, also at an international level. Now, this global youth climate agenda, of course, looked slightly different from the climate priorities that the established powers have, based on the input that we have received. And something else that I learned personally was that climate education is also very, very high on the agenda for from youth across the world. Whereas it's, for example, not so much a topic here at COP, but climate education is just what the younger generation needs to have a conversation with their peers on how this climate just future looks like. It's a bit difficult to talk about it with your 15 or 25-year-old neighbor if they don't know what exactly is causing climate change, and all they see is just a dry land, for example. So that is very high on our agenda. And then other topics are, of course, how to include youth constructively, because we know that youth are important. I mean, that's been said like 1,000 times already, but what does that mean in practice? And one of the suggestions in our global youth climate agenda is for each delegation here at COP to include youth structurally every year in their delegations, preferably 2. So you can have 2 young people with different perspectives. I'm very happy to see that this is already the case for the South African delegation. I'm without doubt that that's already contributed a lot of valuable input to the negotiations. For the Netherlands, this is also the case, but for many other countries that we work with, this is still not the case. So the question is, how do we make sure that the governments in which these youth movements are working are listening to the input that they provide? Well, in that regard, we are very lucky to be able to work with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs acknowledges that working or supporting the youth in our own country to do advocacy is not enough when it comes to climate change. Because I don't need to tell you that climate change is a cross-border issue, which makes it important for a country like the Netherlands to also have an understanding of the impact of climate change on youth elsewhere in the world. And since the Netherlands is quite ambitious in pushing other countries to increase their climate ambitions, they want to invest in youth in other countries to increase their advocacy pushes. And that's the entire reason that We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership exists. And it also means that we have access to the diplomatic network of the Netherlands, and through the Dutch embassies in countries like also South Africa, we are able to help these youth climate movements to have a conversation with their governments. Whereas, yeah, for some partners, that is then not the case if they didn't have that connection. So this global youth climate agenda, I think it's already quite clear that it has shown its relevance. But the thing is that we of course want to make sure that this is also applied, the knowledge that is in there. We just launched the Global Youth Climate Agenda before this COP in The Hague, and it was received by the Director General International Cooperation from the Netherlands, who promised us that she would share this with her colleagues from different countries, because we do not only want to depend on the Netherlands when it comes to supporting international youth participation other than just Dutch youth. So this is also a hint for any civil servants from South Africa. I think this is really something you could look into as well, whether it's through HEP or any other initiatives. But also the GAICA is talked about here at side events at COP that we organize at the We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership. And this is also, again, an opportunity for our partner organizations to take the stage. We're usually not speaking ourselves. This is actually quite an exception that I'm sitting here. Usually we would invite our partner organizations to join. Last Monday, we had a dinner with the Dutch Prime Minister, and we also invited some other presidents from also South Africa, actually, but he canceled. But that would have been a great opportunity for our partner organizations to talk about what they need in their countries. And I think this also shows how through the Global Youth Climate Agenda, South African youth impact is really traveling beyond its borders. So I really want to congratulate you with building your impact to the international level. And I'm really, really happy to keep on supporting you in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Teresa. It's incredible to see that the work of South African young people is going out there globally, and we are breaking borders. I love that. Our next speaker is joining us virtually, and he's going to be touching on our activism segment, whereby we'll be sharing the stories of young people that are involved in creative processes that are related to climate change. So really, I'm going to invite Zahir Suleiman, who is one of the national focal points for the Youth Policy Committee. Let's see if we can get him here. Zahir, are you ready?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zahir Suleiman. I'm 20 years old and a member of the Youth Policy Committee, where I currently serve as the national focal point for the Global Change Working Group. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the creative and ambitious lens that young people take in their journey through the climate action space. I'm here to showcase a story of young people holding up their vision for the future through art and interactivity, actually. Now, I'm a student at the University of Witwatersrand, where I major in digital arts and design. And you would normally think that people studying international relations or public affairs would be in the space, but by no means should my degree hold me back or anyone back from joining the climate activism space, nor stop us from being at the policy table. We all know that there's a need for artists out there to share their stories and projects to inspire and educate others without the need for worrying where commas and full stops and all of that go in global agreements. I'm going to ask for the next slide, which is a case study that I would like to share with you all that happened in Johannesburg. In partnership with the city of Joburg and the Next movement convened under the Youth at SIA programs, young people from across the country were given the opportunity to voice their ideas through quick sketches. We were given a prompt and not even an hour, and we had to quickly draw whatever we thought we could. Now, you're looking at these images and you can tell they seem very rushed, chicken scratch almost, but that was the point. It was to allow anyone to use a different medium to get into the space and encourage the use of drawings as a form of activism. From this small workshop, our drawings were sent to cartoonists from all around the world to ideate and digitally concept something more impactful and worthy of being a mural. This was a project that went from South African youth, from high school to university, to then a global network thanks to the Next movement, with special shout out to Lucinda and her team for their amazing work. Once these digital concepts were drawn, a winner was chosen to feature on a nearly 10-story building as a mural that would be cemented in the legacy of City of Joburg. So you're thinking, oh, these drawings? No, this one. I present to you Tsepo, meaning hope. I'm fortunate enough to say that my small sketch was turned into 2 digital concepts by artists from around the world, which was then taken on by Ras Silas Monse, a renowned street artist, and presented in partnership with Zapiro, a world-famous South African cartoonist. But what's most important in the story is the process. Whilst the mural stands tall, showing a vision of young people holding up their future for thousands, if not millions to see, the process was unlike any other. Young people were allowed to be more creative and expressive in their activism, even if they had previous artistic skill or not. Moreover, when the mural was being painted, and we actually have a really touching story on this, children from the neighborhood would come to watch and even joined in the painting process. They looked at the mural and saw their face reflected back at them. They saw a boy that played with them at school. They saw a boy who stood up for his own future. It was my small idea that featured in the legacy and upliftment of the Johannesburg CBD business district. And all it took was a pencil and paper. And before I wrap up, I can even share further how the journey through the activism space and artivism space has taken so many forms, not just with traditional drawing. Young people of South Africa partnered up for the SAYCAP, which you just heard about. But a key aspect of that was the inclusion of stories and digital media. South African youth got together and created and produced a podcast series called Youth Tell All, which shares their climate activism journey to inspire others and spark change. At the core of this, we can see truly how activism is not one medium. Many of your esteemed guests already know the relationship of art and activism, but to you I say, how can we take this further? A thought I'm going to leave you with is how can we implement, educate, raise awareness, track progress, and further our greener earth through new mediums aside from signed agreements every year. Thank you so much. I'll give it back to you, Gabrielo.
Thank you so much, Zahir, for mentioning the how of it all. How can we spread these stories? And that is through social media, which brings us to our next segment on social media. We will be having Otsile Nkadimeng, who is joining us virtually as well. And he is a lead organizer for Fridays for Future SA and is a co-founder for the Sundial movement. He will be sharing stories on social media and the role of social media activism, climate activism on social media with regard to building momentum within the policy space. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Great.
Good evening, good afternoon to you all of there in Egypt. My name is Otsile Nkadimeng, and as mentioned by Gabrielo, I'm the lead organizer for Fridays for Future South Africa and the co-founder of the Sundial movement. Now, what's important to understand is that social media is an intricate part of the activism work that happens here in South Africa. You see, I'm a grade 11 high school student, and getting my peers engaged in the climate space or to even discuss climate change has been a bit of a challenge. And this links to the next slide. So can we please move to it? See, in South Africa, the challenge that we are facing is that we're trying to engage young people in the climate space. around what can be done about climate, but there is a foundational understanding about climate change that is lacking. The educational curriculum, the educational system in the country, yes, does cover climate, but does not give young people the comprehensive climate education that we've heard speakers today speak at long lengths about. And so then the duty fell on us in the climate space, us in the activism space, to do something about this. An organization I helped co-found, the Sundial Movement, serves to do that purpose. The Sundial Movement is essentially a network of high schools that have come together to take action on climate. We have a 3-step mantra that we follow and will be linked at the end. But to give it away now, our first step is to conscientize, then to organize, and then to mobilize. Because we understand that you cannot get anything done without young people having an understanding about climate, then being willing to organize around it and mobilize to hold those in power and those who are at conferences like COP27 accountable to ensure that the commitments that they lay out are in fact in line with the demands that we have for them. Can I please have the next slide? So where do we go from here? Well, what we learned in the space is that we needed to firstly engage young people around what their understanding of climate change was, because we thought we should start with what already exists. And so we decided with the Sundial Movement that we would help facilitate discussions with schools, facilitate these discussions so that we can connect peers in other schools that have an understanding about climate, about how they've run climate education in their schools, how they've run climate literacy in their schools. And then that idea can be adopted into other schools and institutions. But quickly we learned that through these connections that we were making, there was still a little bit of a disconnect. And that disconnect was there was a struggle to get initial buy-in from the student body and from the school's administration and management. So we then decided to reach into social media. Social media allowed us to connect with some of the most influential people in these schools, head boys, head girls, people in these communities that have high influences over young people. This allowed us to engage the younger youth and allowed us to not only be able to have conversations with them, but to find a way to have a climate discussion that is colloquialized, or rather that is phrased and spoken about in a way that it is easy to understand, but not just easy to understand, but is comprehensive. So helps them to understand what climate change is, what is caused by climate change, and what solutions can we be a part of to deal with this. Can I please have the next slide? So part of this was then deciding, okay, we've educated a few people about climate. What can they do about it? And so on September 21st, the Sundial Movement, in conjunction and in partnership with Fridays for Future South Africa, decided that we would embark on a series of walkouts nationally. These walkouts happened on September 21st and served the purposes of starting a discussion in communities about climate, essentially making young people the catalysts for these discussions. Because young people, whether people want to admit it or not, we are the ones that, one, are going to be affected the most by climate. But in the majority of the cases, because we have such a massive vested interest, we are the ones that are willing to go to extreme lengths to make sure that the climate discussion is not just had, but is had in meaningfully, and then the solutions are implemented equitably. Hence why you've seen the amazing young policy change makers that are with you there in person. But on your right, you see an image of St. Mary's for Girls here in Johannesburg, Gauteng. They held their walkouts on September 21st and not just took this as an opportunity to have the discussion around climate, but they took this as an opportunity to find a way to engage their community about climate. This helped to spark a conversation that went not just in their immediate community, but sparked into other schools and other areas, as illustrated on the left. That is the National School of Arts. They decided to embark on their own form of walkouts to, one, educate people in their schooling community and in their parent body about climate change and the wider community that surrounds them. This is an example of how young people using social media, young people using climate change and using their knowledge and their tech savvy can help create a ripple effect that impacts other communities and other people that they otherwise do not engage with. Next slide, please. And so as we are going, well, as we went, we realized that there was a serious need for young people not just to be the leaders of these discussions, but there's a serious need for young people to begin elevating the way in which we discuss climate. And so what we then embarked on was a series of Instagram lives and a series of Instagram posts via individual groups, individual accounts in Sundial Movement and Fridays for Future. We decided that it is not just enough to have these discussions inside of our schools. If we've created a platform for ourselves to be able to discuss climate, not just as schools, kids, or as a community, we should be willing to be the educators in wider society about climate. And so what we then did, and as illustrated in that image there, we decided to take to larger civil society. That is from the June 16th March for Justice and Peace in Johannesburg, Gauteng, Pretoria, Gauteng. This march embarked multiple civil society organizations to take to the presidency of this country a list of demands, a memorandum, outlining what we as young people want to see in our future. I am seeing that my iPad is flashing red to indicate that I am out of time. But as we go to the last slide, I would just like to say that though I may be out of time to speak now, let us make sure that young people are facilitated to take action on climate so that we don't run out of time to save humanity. And as I said at the end, our 3-step mantra will be mentioned. And that is the mission to conscientize, to organize, and to finally mobilize young people so that we can actually end climate change before the decade is out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Otsile. It's incredible to see the work that young people are doing in South Africa. My next speaker is Kopano Moraga, who is an SA delegate, youth delegate here at COP as well. And she will be speaking with regard to social media and the role that it plays in climate activism.
Thank you so much, Gaugelo. As Gaugelo said, my name is Kopano Moraga, and I want to start off by saying I'm a Youth Policy Committee member, and also I was an Art and Digital Media lead or coordinator for the SAYCAP. And in this role, that means that I was responsible, along with my colleagues here, for collecting artwork, stories, and lived experiences of youth all across the country that would and have filled this document that we've got, the SAYCAP, to reflect the lived experiences of the youth that we find all across the country. And this means that I think with regards to living in a very unequal society, it was very difficult to to get to everyone and make sure that everyone is represented. So with Youth at SAYA, an organization that I'm involved with, I had I think the main thing that they do is to provide data, and access so that young people can be able to go into these platforms with data assistance as well. So if it's not data assistance, then they can also organize school or teachers, to be able to allocate a room for young leaders to be able to contribute to the policy space, and those that were also able to contribute to the SAYCAP process. So this is also just something that we've been able to do to try and bridge the digital divide in South Africa. And I think social media has really played a pivotal role in the broadening or the spreading of the SAYCAP, because this meant that in order to launch it, we had to do an SAYCAP takeover with some of our previous, COP delegates, and clearly we're here as well. And this encompassed also digital media, digital designs that we also had to do, which plays a very vital role in having something that is very colorful, that will attract you to be able to say, I want to engage in that. And for the SAYCAP, the biggest thing for us was to highlight the lived experiences, and the young people all across the country. And it was beneficial that, this meant that allocate or collecting all of these in different forms, and not just saying that, you could provide a video, but this was something that we provided youth with the opportunity to say, you can, participate in the way that you feel most comfortable in. And with the SAYCAP takeover, this was when we took over the Youth of Tsaya social media platform to be able to launch and to advocate and to build momentum with regards to the SAYCAP that we'll be launching. And this can be found on the website saycap.org, and we made it a global, website to be able to not just subject it to the South African youth, but to make it open to the global youth at large. And I think touching on the role that social media plays, I want to also formally announce that we are heading into launching the Green Challenge that is in collaboration with UNICEF SA as well. And this is, a Green Challenge that will encompass the 5 pillars of the SAYCAP, which is basically intersectionality, sustainable environmental sustainability, advocacy and activism, systemic transformation, and good governance and advocacy. And I think if Khawhelo can actually just elaborate more on that. And I think we've got a good thing going, and this encompasses just basically, collecting videos of young people who will be able to pick one of the pillars of the SAYCAP, pick a challenge, a project, or an organization that they want to be involved with within their community to address a challenge, with a climate challenge within that community of theirs. And then I just want to hand it over to Khawhelo to just, sum it up, and then hand it over to Paloma as well with closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kopano. With regard to this, we're going to have Haja actually join us from South Africa. Are you ready?
I am ready for you. Hi, everybody. Are you able to see me? Hi, good day, everybody. I just want to be able to see. I hope everybody's able to see me. So, so we've got a really exciting announcement to make today. So following Kopano's talk on exactly how social media has the means to keep people informed and connected to matters of all kinds, especially regarding climate change. I think for me personally, that was definitely the way in which I got into the space, and especially when it comes to young people, it has a way to motivate you to participate, because it allows for inclusivity in terms of it's a remote activity. And so so we have a very exciting announcement today to make regarding the South African Youth Climate Action Plan as well. I think, especially considering we have this amazing document that we have come up with, that has been written, that has been published, and that we constantly speak about. But I think if there's something we all struggle a little bit with, it is implementation, and taking all of these things that we have to say and making it a reality, something that we are able to see in our everyday lives. Which brings us to, we are inviting young people to join the climate change conversation. We are asking young people to come and tell us how their solutions to climate change can relate to the 5 pillars of the YCAP that was previously mentioned. So that is intersectionality, adaptation, and awareness and adaptation. Environmental sustainability, the systemic transformation, as well as climate finance. And we are asking them to come to as well as good governance. I'm so sorry about that. So when it comes to climate change, we hear of these big voices in the space. We hear of Greta, we hear of Vanessa, and you hear of conferences like COP27. But there are young South Africans, I mean, as you've heard in this entire panel, that are also making a change, that are also active in the climate space. And so we are inviting, like I said, young people from across South Africa to participate in this, in making this plan a reality. So young people are to choose one of the pillars from the South African Youth Climate Action Plan. They are then to post a photo or a 1-minute video telling us about their solution, an idea or a project to make climate change that relates to the chosen pillar of the South African YCAP. They need to do so by posting on by downloading the Goodwall app, and using the hashtag #GoGreenSouthAfrica, as well as writing up a short description about the solution and the project. The deadline for this challenge is the 31st of January, 2023. Now we've got some really cool, motivation to get young people. So 5 winners will receive up to 2,000 Rand each to help bring their ideas to life. Additionally, digital rewards will be awarded to the first entries that meet the winning criteria. So now not only are we asking we're asking to see their own ideas, but we are also willing to provide some seed money to these ideas. And we really hope so. This challenge is the UNICEF Green Challenge, and we're really just hoping to see some of the solutions that young people have to bring forward. Thank you so much, everybody.
Wow, what an incredible project. I am very excited to see what young people have to offer for us. So now to conclude the event, I would really just like to acknowledge our speakers here today. Well done, bravo. I am impressed by the work that young people are doing in South Africa. We are not all lip service. We are not all just talking and no action, but we are active and we are working towards changing our status quo in South Africa. So ladies and gentlemen, with no further ado, I would like to conclude our event today. Thank you for all that are attending, including the virtual participants. Let me see if there's any question that I could take from the virtual audience, as well as just here in the audience. I will allow 2 questions. Okay, well, it seems like there are no questions. That's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for today. Let's go home. Sorry?